So if PEMF is so great and it does so many wonderful things, logical question is, why has PEMF been marginalized for so long? And the answer is actually pretty simple. There was a guy who was named Abraham Flexner, and he was asked by the Carnegie Institution in 1910 to report on the status of medical education in the United States. So he conducted this study and published it in 1910. It's known as the Flexner Report. You can look it up. You can get free copies of it online. You can read about it on Wikipedia. They've got a nice little article on it. So he conducted this study and went to all these different medical schools of all these different types. There used to be all kinds of, many more than there are now, different medical schools 100 years ago that would do all kinds of things. And the thing to keep in mind is Flexner was not a scientist. He was not a clinician, and he was not a medical educator. He was just some guy who was asked to do this. Maybe he had some kind of knowledge that made it possible for him to do this. Anyway, he made this report in 1910. It had immediate and deep and lasting results on medicine, and it pretty much defined, we still have the definition. We have mainstream medicine, and then we have alternative, fringe, quack, whatever you want to call it, medicine. And it was the Flexner Report from 1910 that drew this line. It was a very hard, clear line. So a lot of good things happened, right? I mean, medicine was standardized and regulated. You couldn't just like hang a shingle and open a medical school. You had to be approved by the state. There was a licensure. Those early beginnings of licensing people to practice medicine. All this stuff came from the Flexner Report. It really raised the status of physicians quite a lot. It improved their pay. It reduced, competing, professions and the confusion in medicine. Sort of said, okay, this is what you do. This is, and the argument was that medicine should be based on science, and which I agree with. I think every reasonable person would agree with that. There should be some, science in the sense of not that we understand the nuts and bolts of every last thing of how it works, but that it's replicable. If you say something cures this disease, then somebody else should be able to take that same thing and treat that same disease and effect a cure, right? I mean, if somebody else can't use your secret stuff the way that you're using it and effect a cure, then maybe your secret cure is really not that good. But, scientific demonstration of replicability of outcome is a different thing than understanding, the nuts and bolts of how it works. And unfortunately, the Flexner Report has had a lot of negative consequences. One of them is that alternative approaches to medicine are held to a much, much stricter and higher academic standard of scientific proof than mainstream methods. Mainstream methods are oftentimes just, yeah, we know that works. We don't, that people won't often admit that they don't know exactly why it works, but it works and it's used. Whereas, and in many cases, we don't really understand the molecular biophysical nuts and bolts of mainstream things. We use them anyway. This is true for most drugs. They publish all this information on it, but in the final analysis, they're still figuring out mechanisms of opioids that have been around for, been isolated and been around for 200 years. We're still figuring out how those work. So, even the very first thing that was isolated, for medicine, or the opioids, I think it was 1805, 1806, something like that. They're still not fully understood. So but you can't really reasonably hold your competition to a much, much, much higher standard. But that's what's been happening in alternative medicine. So there were some really questionable outcomes of the Flexner Report. It pretty much eliminated electromedicine, field therapy, electromagnetic field therapy, phototherapy, eclectic medicine. I don't know what that is. Physiomedicalism, naturopathy, and homeopathy were all pretty much stigmatized, and but officially at an institutional level, that is, if people didn't remove, if medical training schools didn't remove these topics from their training, they'd be shut down. Their doors would be closed, and that's exactly what happened. And so, electromedicine as an entire field was stigmatized and was labeled as just quackery, just the same as everything else. Snake oil and all this other stuff. And so for over 100 years, it's been very, very hard to entice a good scientist to take serious time and to take a big risk in their career to study PEMF. And it's been very hard to get clinicians to seriously entertain the thought of actually using PEMF clinically, because you know, the benefits are, yeah, you may help a few people, that's the way they see it, but the risks are you can lose all of your professional credibility, your license, and everything if you make one wrong step. So PEMF has been, it's been stigmatized, and people are largely afraid to do research in this area. To a large extent, deciding to do research in PEMF has ended my academic research career. That's okay with me because I don't like academic research much, and I kind of hold academic administrators in disdain because I don't think they're helping the situation very much either, putting the focus on money and not on curing things. I mean, that's not what medical schools are looking to do. They're looking to pump federal money into their school. They're not really looking to cure things. I mean, when was the last time you picked up a newspaper and saw a big medical advance that was really real and ended up becoming something, you know, from the university? And this is a problem. People are writing books about this now. Hey, you know, it's been 40, 50 years since you guys have really cured anything. You know, come on, we're waiting. So, you know, Flexner had a good initial impact on medicine, but a lot of really long-standing things, and if I may say so, you know, had a big negative effect on women and minorities in medicine. In fact, almost all women and minorities were pretty much shut out of the medical profession as a result of the Flexner Report. Now, if you're, you know, an elderly white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male and you look, you know, distinguished wearing a lab coat and a monocle, you were good. You're good to go for the next 100 years. But if, you know, if you were a minority, a woman, anybody else who they didn't want in the profession, this was sort of an easy way for them to, you know, another lever they could use to force you out. And so I think society, humanity as a whole, has really not benefited in many ways because of the indiscriminately broad application of the Flexner Report. I think to the extent that it said, okay, you have to apply science to scientific education and medical practice, medical education. That's good. Much beyond that, it's been really quite damaging, and we're all suffering the consequences of this more than a century later. And this is when the term quackery really came into the mainstream. Anything that didn't directly, strictly adhere to the standards in the Flexner Report was called quackery, stigmatized, and for the most part, it put research in all of these other things that we call alternative, integrative medicine, put them all in the margins. So they're kind of like, the research in those fields is literally a century behind the research in mainstream medicine. The next slide is number 8. How many different forms of PEMF are there? Well, earlier I pointed out that PEMF is not just one thing. It's not like either you're doing PEMF or you're not. And so it really doesn't, you know, it's a lot of different things. The analogy I use is chemicals. You know, chemicals are a lot of things. You can't just say chemicals do this or chemicals don't do that, because chemical, okay, could be talking about water, plutonium, testosterone, 3 different chemicals, right? They have 3 different, very different effects on biological systems. So you can't just make the broad statement, chemicals work or they don't work. And it's the same thing is true for PEMF. So it makes no sense to just simply say PEMF works or PEMF does not work. You have to be really specific what kind of PEMF you're using. And so, like, well, how many different kinds of PEMF are there? So if you take this sort of regulatory definition that any sort of measurable change in the frequency or the waveform constitutes a difference, and you allow a, you know, certain level of tolerance for, you know, is 10 hertz different from 11, or does that be 10.1 versus 10? Or is 10 hertz basically the same as 11? I mean, you know, you sort of set the tolerance, then you're looking at frequencies, pulse shapes, pulse patterns, amplitudes, etc. You can calculate how many different types of PEMF there are, from very low frequency up to, you know, not including the ionizing high frequency stuff like ultraviolet or anything like that. You know, how many different types. And I've calculated this, and it's about 1 quadrillion. So it's a 1 with 15 zeros after it. It's a huge number. It's millions of times larger than all the known chemical species, known and theorized chemical species in the universe. And I've actually posted this. I call it the PEMF calculator. You can go to my webpage, micro-pulse.com, click on PEMF calculator. It'll take you to it. And you can download it as an Excel spreadsheet. And I've got it set up so you can actually change the numbers. You can change the tolerances, and you can look at different aspects of PEMF, and you can decide for yourself, you know, hey, How many different kinds are there? And even if you try to really reduce PEMF down to just a few things that matter, you can still end up easily with millions of different types instead of quadrillions. You can end up with hundreds of thousands or millions of different types of PEMF. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense to just lump all of PEMF together. You really have to be specific about what you're talking about. So in all of my research, I've been really, really careful to measure, quantify, and be really specific about what kind of PEMF I'm talking about when I do any kind of research. The next question I get asked very frequently, probably way too frequently, because to me it indicates just how bad the information is on the internet and how hard it is to get the truth out versus the marketing misinformation. Does PEMF have special frequencies? Well, that should be the first question you ask, especially when you're doing research on this, but you should quickly be able to find out that that doesn't seem to be the case. It's my scientific opinion that there's no really special, and by special I mean a really precise frequency that does one thing, or a precise map. You know, this frequency will treat or cure this disease. No such thing. There's no scientific support for that at all. Now, some people will say, well, I found a paper and it said 10 hertz PEMF, you know, treats or cures this thing. And I say, well, did they test 11 hertz? Well, no. Did they test 9 hertz? Well, no. So how do you know it's exactly 10? Well, they don't. And papers in general for PEMF will test one type of PEMF versus nothing, no PEMF. So they're not really sort of finding it on the head of a pin. They're just sort of saying, yeah, something in the range. We haven't figured out how big this range is, but something around 10 hertz, you know, as opposed to 100 or 1,000 hertz, it seems to work. But there's no scientific evidence to support the assertion that I can find anywhere that a specific frequency has a specific effect in the realm of PEMF. PEMF frequencies seem to work in really broad bands, not in precise values. So if something's working at about 5 pulses per second, it probably still works at about 3 or 4. It probably still works at maybe 10 or 20. There do seem to be differences when you're talking about a few pulses per second or hertz, you know, 5 or 10 versus maybe 100. There's physiologic reasons to believe the body may respond to different things. If you're applying PEMF to the head, you can get brainwave entrainment. And, you know, when you're at 2, 3, 4 hertz, you're talking about, like, you know, delta waves versus, you know, when you get up in the high teens and 20s, you might be talking about beta waves or something like that. So there's other kind of collateral effects. But when it comes to the sort of primary effect of PEMF, which I hypothesize is an anti-inflammatory effect, you know, it seems to work everywhere in the range of, you know, anything under maybe a couple of hundred hertz seems to work. And sometimes you get a 10 or 15% improvement using a certain range of frequencies over another. But there's definitely not like a specific magical frequency. Now, people get really violent about this. I mean, I've had conversations where people are sort of like, you know, tell me the frequency, tell me the frequency. I'm like, guy, you know, I don't know. There's no such thing as one special magical frequency. But people are led to believe that there are, and there are people on the internet who will sell a PEMF device that has like one special secret frequency, you know, and they'll tell you, you know, sometimes it's mystical, numerological, sometimes it's just a secret, sometimes it has to do with resonating with the earth and all these other things. But there's no scientific evidence to show that that is special compared to any other frequency that's near it or even considerably different from it. So there's a couple of things I can tell you that are, in my experience, this is the truth, okay, as far as I can tell. NASA did not ever find any special PEMF frequencies. This is an urban legend that popped up around in the 1990s, around the year 2000. I've actually had people scream at me, you know, like, NASA has 1,000 papers proving that, you know, these special Earth frequencies are essential for health. And I've challenged people. I say, okay, get me one. Just if there's thousands of them, just send me one paper, and we'll go through it. And we'll see if it says exactly what you said and see if it's a reasonable scientific paper. And if that's the case, I'll publicly admit that I'm wrong, you know. And so people say, oh, you know, they'll yell, they'll keep yelling. I say, okay, calm down. Just bring one paper. Here's my email. We'll discuss it. Well, you know, I'll blog about it. I'll do a mea culpa. I was wrong, but that never happened, and I've offered this to people many times. Normally, I'll just say calmly, go and find a paper, send it to me, and I almost never hear from anybody. However, in one case, there was a journalist who actually said, "Haha, I've got you," and he sent me 3 papers. And he said, "Everybody's talking about these. These are the papers that prove that you have to resonate with the Earth's frequencies, or you'll get very, very sick." And so I said, "Well, actually, I'm familiar with those papers. Those were papers done in the 1960s on people in deep caves who were isolated from sunlight, who their circadian rhythm changed because they didn't see the sun for a while." And it was these papers where they started to discover that if you're buried in a cave or you're someplace isolated from natural sunlight cycles, that your circadian rhythm kind of goes out of whack, and most people are closer to 25-hour day than a 24-hour day. And that's what those papers were talking about. And there was a little bit of discussion, and they had some unfortunate, unclear wording about magnetic fields in a Faraday cage that might also, but there was no evidence for it. It was just speculation in the paper. Well, maybe that also has an effect, but this was taken as like proof. And so a lot of people were talking about these papers as if they proved that the Earth resonance really did. So I'm not talking about some guy in a blog, some idiot with a video like me saying it's been proven. I want to see a scientific paper or real repeatable data that shows that a specific resonant frequency with the Earth, or a specific secret frequency somewhere, has a measurable, repeatable, beneficial effect that other frequencies don't have. There's no evidence for that. I've had people scream at me. They say, "Well, then you just aren't familiar with the literature at NASA." Well, let me tell you something. All right, around 1995 to 2000, I was at the University of Michigan, and I was working on NASA-funded research, trying to figure out how to prevent bone and tissue loss in zero gravity. And I was developing instrumentation to simulate zero gravity, in both for cells and for whole organisms, mice and rats. I'm very deeply involved in this. One of my colleagues, she was the first senior scientist for the International Space Station before it was launched. She was a visiting senior scientist, and that's all she did was NASA work. And I talked to her all the time about this. We shared students, and we did lab stuff together. She had never heard about these experiments that supposedly happened. Another one of my friends now was an astronaut who spent more than 4 months on the Mir space station. He's an electrical engineer, has a medical degrees, MD, electrical engineer. His name is Dave Wolf, and he is a famous astronaut, and he had the laboratory at Johnson Space Center where I did some consulting and worked with one of his technicians to do the experiments. And he had never heard of it. In fact, he was very, very skeptical about the effects of electromagnetic fields on biological systems all through this time period. So basically the senior visiting scientist on the International Space Station, the number one, human factors, biological effects, astronaut who spent months and months in orbit, who ran a big lab at Johnson Space Center that studied these things, these people that I know, that I work with frequently, myself doing consulting in this and also working on NASA-funded research and everything in that area at that time. None of us ever heard of any kind of research that showed anything like what people are talking about in these urban legends. And so, I challenge people, find the papers for me. I didn't hear about these people. I didn't know about them. None of these ideas were incorporated in any of the actual work, the actual real living people who were scientists working in and for NASA at the time. None of us had any knowledge of this. And so it turns out it's an urban legend that was promulgated by a bunch of PEMF marketers over the last 20 years, where they, made up stories about flying around the Earth in a space shuttle and watching cells and how they get healthy when they flew through certain magnetic fields, and then they get sick and they went over the North Pole and there was no magnetic field. So they're making these things up, and to a certain extent it's been sort of blown up into this big marketing angle by low integrity PEMF marketers. That's what it is. And so it's not science, and these papers don't exist. This body of work doesn't exist. This is just an urban myth. Now, I'm not saying that these frequencies don't work. That's the funny thing about it. Schumann frequencies, 7.83 hertz or whatever, is a perfectly good frequency. It's sort of in the range of 5 to 10, and it'll work just as well as 5, it'll work just as well as 10. And if you look at Schumann harmonics, those work pretty well too. So you can't do the experiment, say, whoa, those frequencies work and therefore Bob is wrong. You know, you have to show that only those frequencies work and that frequencies that are a little bit different from them don't work, because that's how resonance works. You got to be right on the frequency. You can't be sort of off. So, you know, no paper, nobody's ever shown that those work really well and only those work really well and only those have a specific biological effect. It doesn't exist. And that whole body of literature is just it's just sort of been made up by people, some of whom, actually one or two of whom I know now are in jail for doing terrible things. A lot of them have sort of left the PEMF world and are trying to scam innocent people doing other things. Bad people, but they've left this lingering sort of myth behind them that is really difficult to deal with. And a lot of people are violently in support of it. So if you are one of these people who supports the fact that there are secret special frequencies, you know, please come to your senses. It doesn't seem to be the case. And if I'm wrong, please, I'm very easy to find. Bob Dennis, University of North Carolina. You know, I own Micropulse, you know, LLC. You just go to our webpage. Send me the paper or the 1,000 papers that show that I'm wrong, and I'll be delighted to get on YouTube and extol you to the highest heights and talk about how it was wrong. And I've been challenging people this for almost a decade now, and nothing. So anyway, if you've got that secret paper somewhere, let me know. So does frequency matter? Well, that's a different question. Frequency does seem to matter. It's just that there's not special secret ones. So if somebody tries to sell you a special secret frequency in a PEMF system or any other system, it's a pretty safe bet that they're just scamming you, and you can just say, you know, hey, thanks, but no thanks. I think I'll keep my $15,000 and not waste it on your system. What matters? Well, there's two things that really matter in PEMF as far as I can tell. Number one is pulse shape. That seems to be much, much, much more important than frequency. And when you vary pulse shape versus varying frequency, in the experiments that I've done, it's at least 85 to 95% of the effects of PEMF have to do with the exact shape of the pulse. And I mean really well-defined shape of the pulse versus anything related to frequency. However, changing frequency can have a really good beneficial effect. For example, there's an effect called neuroaccommodation or habituation, where biological systems seem to, over time, they'll seem to start to ignore signals if it's monotonic, like a monotonic hum or any other kind of input to a biological system that's always the same, that carries no information. The biological system will actually start to suppress its sensitivity and its response to that. So I would say, when it comes to PEMF, the most important thing to do is to change the frequency to counteract the effects of accommodation and habituation. As long as you change it within a reasonable range. So, you know, I don't think there's an exact frequency like 7.83 hertz that matters and everything else doesn't matter. But I would say it's valuable to change it in the range of maybe 5 to 10 hertz. And you're going to sweep up and you're going to sweep down. You're going to do that at different rates. And that, in the experiments that I've done, has resulted in PEMF systems that can be used every day, all day, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, and they remain just as effective after years as they were on the very first day, and sometimes they're even more effective. So I can't think of any drug where they can say, yeah, you use this drug every day, and 10 years from now it's going to be as effective or more effective than it was the first day you took it. Certainly not any signal blocking drugs, you know, like pain signal blocking drugs, anything like that. Most things that are sort of like a one-size-fits-all specific narrow range of stimuli, your body will eventually find a way to ignore it, work around it. But if you use PEMF intelligently, and one of the things to do there is to change the frequency. It doesn't have to even be periodic. It can be random. I've done some tests with random frequency changes too, and that seems to work really, really well. As long as you're in a reasonable frequency, you know, range of frequencies, it seems to counteract this whole problem of signal habituation. So in the last slide, I talked about the relative importance of pulse shape versus pulse frequency in PEMF. And, you know, I'm looking at one type of PEMF, which I call ICES, which is trademarked. I own the trademark, and I own the trademark so that I can control the definition of what it is. It's not because I want to be the only person who can sell this. And in fact, I'd be perfectly happy to let other people use or license other people to use this term as long as they follow the definition of it. It's the same thing with like Bluetooth or SD cards or anything else like that. They trademark the name so that they can control, the standard. And if you don't meet their standard, then you can't call it that. And this is why I've come up with ICES. It is inductively coupled electrical stimulation. So I don't even think that there's strong evidence that it's the magnetic fields that are having an effect. I would argue scientifically that it's the induced electric fields that are having an effect. And just very briefly, this all comes down to pulse shape. So I think it's at least 85 to 95% of the effectiveness of low frequency PEMF comes down to the exact shape of each pulse. So let me kind of walk you through that. This is what I'm thinking, subject to, continued scientific testing and developing. But this has kind of come out of a long series of experiments that I've done over the last 22 years. And every time I test this, there is stronger and stronger support for the fact that this seems to be a good description of what's going on. So whenever I try to do something that disproves this, I fail. And whenever I try to design something that's based upon this working, it seems to work better and better, and the more I refine this hypothesis. So what it basically amounts to is there's no such thing as a pure square wave. All electromagnetic waves at most are trapezoidal. So it takes a certain amount of time to build up the magnetic field. You can keep it on for a certain amount of time. It takes a certain amount of time for that field to decay. And when the magnetic field is changing, magnetic field strength, we'll call it capital B. When that field is changing, you can measure how quickly the field changes. This is where a little bit of calculus comes in. It's actually, there's a lot more to it than meets the eye. You have to sort of take kind of, university level sort of electromagnetism and physics to understand it. So it's mostly physicists or electrical engineers. They can understand the first half of all of this very well. How it relates to the biology is less clear to them, and that's kind of the disconnect that has really held back the science of PEMF, I think. But I'll tell you, the first half is that you have to change the magnetic field quickly enough that you're in the right range of how quickly you're changing the magnetic field. And what is that right range? Well, how quickly you change the magnetic field can be described in calculus as the first time derivative of the magnetic field B, which is dB dt. And dB dt, when you're changing magnetic field, it equals the induced electric field. All right, so this is one of the four Maxwell's equations, known as Faraday's law, that had changed humanity from the 18th century, in which there was basically nothing electronic, to the 20th and 21st century, where our whole lives are electronic and electromechanical. It's because these four equations, we really understand them well, called classical electromagnetism. One of the equations is the Faraday equation. When you change a magnetic field, you can calculate the resulting electric field that's induced. And so this is called induction, and a lot of things work this way. The magnetic strips on credit cards, induction cooktops on stoves, motors, and all kinds of stuff all around you work through electromagnetic induction. So we talk about the slew rate, which is the rate at which the magnetic field increases or decreases. That's dB dt. It equals the induced electric field. And so the correct units to talk about this are not Gauss. Gauss is how big is the magnetic field, but the correct units are Gauss per second, like how quickly does, and in the case of Gauss, it's the magnetic flux density change in, how quickly is it changing in time. So when you're really looking at these pulses, what really matters from an electromagnetic standpoint is how quickly you're changing the magnetic field, not how big it gets, and not how often you turn it on and off, but how quickly it ramps up or ramps down. That tells you how big the induced field is. Now the other half of the equation, and for people who are really kind of nerdy, the way to look at induction in living systems is, the first half of it is this equation I was just talking about. The second half of it is what's happening in the aqueous spaces around cells in tissues, but also around organelles inside cells, because the field effect of magnetism is going to go completely transparently through tissues, probably without much interference. And then when you change the magnetic field, it has a much more uniform in space, volumetrically, a much more uniform effect on the induced electric field. So it's like electrical stimulation, but it's many thousands of times more efficient because it's affecting this wide field. It's not just some sort of lightning bolt path of least resistance like using electrodes is. When you use electromagnetic induction, it's much more efficient and it's much more uniform. It's much more gentle, but uniform over a much larger volume of space. And the other half of the equation is you need to think about the PEMF coils and the aqueous spaces in and around cells as two halves of a transformer, okay, electrical transformer. So you've got the primary PEMF system that's driving it, and the secondary, which is the cells and the tissues and the liquid, the aqueous spaces inside and around, around cells. So a cell is a perfect sort of way, little blob that's an insulator. So you're going to get induced fields of current, ions running around the cell, and this is what I hypothesize, and other people hypothesize this as well, is being sensed by PEMF. But the other half of this is that you have to, there's two things in biology that tell you about electrical sensitivity. One of them is the amplitude of the electrical signal, and that's E, and that is defined by dB/dt. So the amplitude of that signal has to be large enough that the cell can detect it. But for biology to interpret electromagnetism, or actually ion flow, as a signal, in many cases that signal has to persist for a certain amount of time. So this is true for synaptic activation of muscle from nerve, for example. So the musculoskeletal system is dialed into this thing. The two terms are chronaxy and rheobase. So rheobase is how big is the field, chronaxy is how long do you keep that field on. So you have to keep a field on for a certain amount of time at a certain amplitude to elicit a response from musculoskeletal tissues, especially excitable tissues like nerve and muscle, but also, hypothetically, this mechanism would be retained for many tissues, right? So if you keep a big enough signal, big enough E field on for a long enough time, you meet the chronaxy and rheobase requirements for eliciting a response. And this is the half of the sort of equation that electrical engineers don't really understand, and physicists, is that, okay, you've got the right dB/dt, but it's got to, for it to be interpreted as information by cells, it has to be on for the right amount of time. And this is something you can't calculate from first principles. You have to measure it. And chronaxy and rheobase have been measured. They've been known since about 1907 in early experiments on muscle and nerve excitability. And different tissues have different chronaxy and different rheobase. Like your heart muscle has a different time period. It requires about a millisecond before you can elicit contraction in cardiac muscle, but it's about 1/5 to 1/10 of that for skeletal muscle. So you can very safely stimulate skeletal muscle and use all of these nerve impulses back and forth right next to the heart without actually having any fear of interfering with heart function when your brain is in your spinal cord are sending signals back and forth to muscle, because the time requirement for the pulse is different in the musculoskeletal system than it is in the cardiovascular system. It's much longer. So the theory that I've been operating on, the hypothesis that I've been using to incorporate into ICES, is to emulate the musculoskeletal system's field strength and pulse duration, and you have to do just a little bit of calculus on the magnetic field so that it ends up inducing an electrical field that meets these two criteria. And when you do that, you're within the definition that I've patented like 4 different times, just so I can control what that definition is, because I want it to be scientifically accurate and something that we can rely on, is workable. It meets the criteria for ICES, which means it has to have a certain slope and it has to have a certain time duration. And every time, this is determined by experiment. I've measured it numerous times, and there is a sort of a sweet spot. If you keep the first time derivative of the pulse active for long enough at a large enough amplitude, we see biological responses reliably all the time.